This place cost me $1, and it is all I have left. Your mother left it for you, whatever happens." On her 18th birthday, Callista Torrance was handed a garbage bag full of her clothes and a single crumpled dollar bill. Her wealthy family thought they had broken her. They did not know that single dollar would buy a ruined stone cottage and unearth a centuries-old secret that would destroy them all. The heavy mahogany doors of the Torrance estate slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the manicured courtyard like a gunshot. Callista Torrance stood on the sweeping gravel driveway, the bitter wind of early November, whipping her thin coat around her legs. The sky above the Pennsylvania countryside was the color of wet concrete pressing down on the world with the weight of everything she had just lost. At her feet sat a black plastic trash bag. Inside it were 4 sweaters, 3 pairs of jeans, a toothbrush, and a faded photograph of her late biological mother, Verity. That was the sum total of 18 years spent under the roof of one of the wealthiest families in Bucks County. In her trembling right hand, she held a single crumpled $1 bill. Waverly Torrance had not thrown it at her. That would have been too crude, too honest. Instead, Waverly had placed the bill on the marble step at the top of the staircase, then stepped back, forcing Callista to bend down and pick it up, while Waverly watched from above. A small cruelty, precise and deliberate, designed to remind Callista exactly where she stood in the architecture of this family. "Consider this a lesson in reality, Callista," Waverly had said, her voice as smooth and cold as the cashmere shawl draped across her shoulders. She looked down at her stepdaughter with eyes that held all the warmth of flat silver coins. "You are 18 now. Your father and I have decided that shielding you from the real world is doing you a disservice. You have no trust fund. You have no allowance. You are no longer our financial burden." Callista had looked past Waverly, searching the shadows of the grand foyer behind her. Sutton Torrance stood there, CEO of Torrance Maritime Corporation, a man whose signature could move cargo ships across 3 oceans. He was swirling a glass of scotch in his right hand, the amber liquid catching the chandelier light, and he would not meet his daughter's eyes. He had always been a spineless man when it came to his second wife. Callista had understood that for years in the quiet, resigned way that children understand the failures of their parents. But watching him stand there in the warmth of his $60 million home, while Waverly cast his only biological daughter out into the freezing morning air, was a betrayal that cracked something deep and foundational inside Callista's chest. Not her heart, something harder than that, something structural. She turned to leave, and then she heard it, the quick shuffle of shoes on marble. She stopped. Her pulse spiked. She looked back over her shoulder and saw Sutton standing at the threshold of the open door, his mouth moving slightly, forming a word that never became sound. For one desperate second, Callista believed he was going to call her back. Then Waverly's voice sliced through the foyer like a blade. "Sutton, come inside." Sutton Torrance retreated into the shadows of his own house, like a shadow being recalled by its master. The heavy door closed behind him, and Callista knew with absolute and terrible certainty that it had closed forever. She picked up the trash bag with her left hand. She curled the crumpled dollar bill into her right fist, and she walked down the long gravel driveway away from the only life she had ever known, with her phone battery hovering at 9% and not a single person in the world expecting her. The walk to Doylestown took nearly an hour. 3 miles of winding suburban roads lined with bare oaks and stone walls, past estates with iron gates and horse pastures, past a world that had never really been hers. The cold gnawed through her thin coat and settled into her bones. She did not cry. The shock was still too fresh for tears. She was operating on something deeper than emotion now, something mechanical and desperate. She had one lead, a cryptic letter from a law firm that had arrived exactly 1 week ago, addressed to her personally and marked in heavy black ink to be opened upon your 18th birthday. Do not disclose to Sutton or Waverly Torrance. Halfway to town, Callista stopped in front of a small roadside diner. The neon sign in the window buzzed and flickered, advertising coffee and breakfast 24 hours a day. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had not eaten since the previous night, and even then Waverly had made sure dinner was a tense, silent affair, a kind of last supper served with contempt instead of bread. Callista pushed open the glass door, dragging her garbage bag behind her. The warm air hit her face like a blessing. The diner smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee and something sweet baking in the back. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled into a high bun and a grease-stained apron tied tight around her waist. She had the kind of face that had seen everything at least twice and had stopped being surprised by any of it. The woman looked at Callista. She looked at the garbage bag. She looked at the thin coat and the wind-burned cheeks and the white-knuckled fist clutching a crumpled bill. She asked no questions. She placed a cup of hot coffee and a thick slice of buttered toast on the counter in front of Callista. "I do not have money to pay for this," Callista said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not ask if you had money," the woman said. Her name, according to the embroidered patch on her apron, was Lark Felding. She studied Callista's face for a long moment, and something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, not of a stranger, but of a ghost. "Those eyes," Lark said quietly. "I would know them anywhere. You are Verity Winslow's girl." Callista went still. Winslow was her mother's maiden name, the name the Torrance family never used, the name that had been scrubbed from every document and conversation in the estate as thoroughly as if Verity had never existed. "You knew my mother?" Lark did not answer directly. She wiped the counter with a rag, her movements slow and deliberate. "Verity used to sit in that exact chair," she said. "Every Saturday night, black coffee. She would write in a leather notebook for hours. Never told me what." Lark looked up. "You need to get going. Tobin Caulfield is probably waiting for you." Callista's blood went cold. "How do you know that name?" Lark turned toward the kitchen. "When you need work," she said over her shoulder, "come back here. Night shift is always short." Then she disappeared through the swinging door, leaving Callista alone with 100 questions and no time to ask them. The law offices of Caulfield and Associates occupied the second floor above a struggling bakery on the main street of Doylestown. Callista shoved open the glass door and hauled her garbage bag up a narrow staircase that groaned under every step. The hallway smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco and the particular mustiness of a building that had been standing since before anyone alive could remember. Attorney Tobin Caulfield was waiting for her behind a desk buried under towers of yellowed folders. He was approximately 75 years old with wild tufts of white eyebrows, ink-stained fingers, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of a long, narrow nose. He looked less like a lawyer and more like a retired professor who had wandered into someone else's office and forgotten to leave. "I expected you might come today," Caulfield said, gently gesturing for her to sit in a worn leather wingback chair that was older than she was. He eyed the garbage bag on the floor beside her, but asked no questions about it. Instead, he pulled a thick manila folder from his desk drawer. The folder was yellowed with age, and the edges were soft from years of careful handling. "Your mother Verity was a brilliant woman." Caulfield began adjusting his glasses. His voice carried the weight of someone who had kept a secret for a very long time and was relieved to finally set it down. "Before she passed away, she anticipated that your father's second marriage might complicate your future. She did not have liquid wealth to leave you. Your father made absolutely certain of that during their divorce. The proceedings were brutal. He stripped her of everything, every account, every asset, every penny she had contributed to the marriage." Caulfield paused, letting the gravity of that settle. But Verity was clever, far cleverer than Sutton ever gave her credit for. She found a parcel of land deep in the woods of Bucks County, backing up against the state game lands. On it sits a stone cottage built in the late 1800s. Verity purchased it secretly years ago under a very specific and ironclad trust established through this firm. "The property has been held in my custody until your 18th birthday." He slid a heavy piece of parchment across the desk. It was a deed of transfer, the paper thick and cream-colored, the kind of document that felt important in your hands. "So I own a house?" Callista asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Not quite yet," Caulfield said, tapping a line at the bottom of the page. "To make the transfer legally binding and prevent your father from ever claiming it was a hidden marital asset, the arrangement was structured as a pending sale. The purchase price was set to the absolute legal minimum required to constitute a binding contract under Pennsylvania consideration law." Callista looked at the number written in neat calligraphic ink at the bottom of the deed. "Purchase price $1. She stared at it. Then slowly she uncurled her frozen fingers and smoothed out the crumpled dollar bill that Waverly Torrance had placed on the marble step as a final act of contempt. She set it perfectly in the center of Tobin Caulfield's desk. "I will buy it." Caulfield looked at the bill for a long moment, Then he reached into his drawer and produced a second item, a sealed envelope cream-colored with Callista's name written across the front in Verity's handwriting. Your mother left this as well, Caulfield said. Her instructions were very specific. She told me to say only open this when you truly need to remember why you are fighting, not today. You will know when the time is right. Callista took the envelope. She ran her thumb across her mother's handwriting, feeling the slight indentations of the pen strokes. She slid it into the inside pocket of her coat close to her chest and did not open it. As she stood to leave, Caulfield called her back. Callista, there is one more thing I should tell you. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. That property had been vacant for nearly 50 years. I once suggested to Verity that she sell it and place the proceeds into a trust fund for you. She refused. She told me, and I remember her exact words, that a house is more important than money, Emmett. My daughter will understand when the time comes. He put his glasses back on. I never understood what she meant by that. Callista stood in the doorway, the sealed envelope pressing against her ribs. Her mother had known something about that house, something she had never told even her own lawyer. 3 hours later, a hired cab dropped Callista at the edge of a rutted dirt driveway that disappeared into a dense canopy of ancient oak and dying pine. The cab driver looked at the trash bag, looked at the darkening woods, and asked if she was sure. She was sure. She dragged her bag through overgrown brambles, ducking under low-hanging branches that clawed at her coat. The November light was already dying, turning the forest into a cathedral of gray shadows. And then as the trees thinned and the sky opened into a clearing, choked with dead grass and wild thorns, the silhouette of Fenwick Cottage emerged against the darkening sky. It was by every conventional standard a nightmare. The cottage was constructed of heavy dark fieldstone, each piece fitted together by hands that had been dust for over a century. The cedar shake roof sagged dangerously in the middle, missing hundreds of shingles like teeth knocked out in a fight. Wild ivy had consumed the entire eastern wall, its tendrils creeping through the shattered panes of leaded glass windows. The front door hung on a single rusted iron hinge, tilted at an angle that suggested it might surrender to gravity at any moment. Callista pushed the heavy oak door open. The air inside smelled of wet earth, rotting wood, and decades of utter abandonment. The floorboards were thick planks of old-growth timber, some warped by decades of moisture, others still solid enough to hold weight. Cobwebs draped the corners like funeral veils. But the single most impressive feature in the entire ruin dominated the far wall, a massive fieldstone fireplace stretching from floor to ceiling. Its hearth was enormous, wide enough to roast an entire ox, built from heavy granite slabs that seemed almost too large and too finely cut for a cottage this size. Callista noticed that detail without understanding it. The fireplace looked like it belonged in a manor house, not a one-room cottage in the backwoods of Bucks County. She filed the observation away and turned her attention to more immediate concerns. She had no heat, no electricity, no running water. The temperature outside was dropping below 40 degrees and the wind was finding every crack in the stone walls. Callista dropped her garbage bag onto the dusty floorboards. She stood alone in the center of the ruined cottage, surrounded by the smell of decay and the sound of wind howling through broken glass. She looked into the dark, empty mouth of the massive stone hearth. I will die before I ask them for a single dime, she whispered to the empty room. And she meant it. The first 3 weeks at Fenwick Cottage were a brutal and relentless education in what it actually means to survive. Not the glamorous cinematic version of independence, not the montage set to inspiring music, but the real thing. Grueling, bone-aching, filthy. Callista spent her days scavenging fallen branches from the surrounding woods, learning through trial and painful error. How to split logs with a heavy rusted axe she found half buried in the collapsing shed behind the cottage. She hauled water from a small, freezing creek a quarter-mile away, boiling it over a makeshift fire pit in the yard because the massive indoor hearth was completely blocked. The chimney flue had collapsed years ago, packing the throat of the chimney with hundreds of pounds of brick and morite debris. Without clearing it, the fireplace was useless. Nothing more than a decorative mouth of stone that breathed cold air into the room. Her hands transformed. The soft, perfectly manicured fingers that had once fit the aesthetic of the Torrens family portrait became calloused, blistered, and permanently stained with soot and dirt. She split a fingernail down to the quick on her third day, and did not have the luxury of caring. She walked into town and found Lark Felding's diner. The graveyard shift 11 at night until 7 in the morning was hers, without an interview. Lark simply handed her an apron and pointed to the coffee machine. The tips were meager, but they bought essentials: a heavy-duty sleeping bag, rated to 15 degrees, a kerosene heater that smelled like an oil refinery, but produced enough warmth to keep her alive, a blue tarp to patch the worst of the roof leaks, and cases of cheap canned soup. During those late shifts, Lark would sometimes talk. Not much, just fragments offered the way a person offers bread to someone who is starving, one piece at a time. Verity used to come every Saturday. Black coffee, leather notebook. She wrote for hours. Once Verity had said to Lark, "I am building something that Sutton can never take away." Lark never learned what she meant, but she warned Callista, her voice low and serious across the counter at 3 in the morning. "Be careful with that property, child. Your mother never explained why she chose that exact piece of land, but I always had the feeling she knew something about it that nobody else did." On the 19th night, Callista nearly broke. A freezing rain had come through, driving sleet sideways through the gaps in the tarp. Water poured through 3 separate holes in the roof, soaking her sleeping bag, pooling on the warped floorboards. She sat in the only dry corner of the cottage, knees pulled to her chest, shivering so violently her teeth ached. The kerosene heater sputtered and coughed, running low on fuel. She looked at her hands in the flickering light. Raw, cracked, stained, unrecognizable. For the first time since she had left the Torrance estate, Callista cried. Not from sadness, from a fury so deep and so helpless it had no other outlet. She picked up her phone, charged to 11% on a cheap portable battery, and opened her contacts. She found Sutton's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. One call, that was all it would take. Just say the words. "I am sorry. I was wrong. Please let me come home." And then she saw it clearly. Sutton retreating into the shadow of the foyer, his mouth forming a word that never came. Waverly's voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Sutton, come inside." And Sutton obeying. If she called, Sutton would not answer. Or if he did, Waverly would be the one listening. And the price of that rescue would be the last shred of something Callista could not name, but knew she could not survive without. She closed the phone. She set it on the wet floor. She lay down on the soaked sleeping bag, pulled her damp coat tighter around her body, and did not sleep. But she did not call. That was the night Callista Torrance stopped running from her circumstances and began slowly and painfully to accept them. Not with grace, not with wisdom, with the raw, stubborn teeth, clenched refusal of a person who has nothing left to lose. The next morning, wind tore across the clearing like a living thing. Callista was straddling the peak of the sagging roof, fighting to secure the blue tarp that was being ripped free by a late November gale, her fingers so numb she could barely grip the fabric. Below her, the ground was a long way down. Above her, the sky was the color of iron. That was when she heard the engine. A battered Ford pickup truck rattled down the dirt driveway, its suspension groaning over every rut. The truck stopped near the front of the cottage. A young man stepped out. He was in his early 20s, broad-shouldered, with a dusting of red brick powder on his heavy canvas work jacket and dark hair whipped sideways by the wind. He looked up at Callista on the roof with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and professional horror. "You are going to break your neck up there," he shouted over the howling wind. Before Callista could argue, he grabbed an extension ladder from the bed of his truck, set it against the cottage wall, climbed up with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life on rooftops, and expertly secured the tarp, using heavy-duty masonry staples he pulled from a pouch on his belt. The whole operation took him less than 5 minutes. Back on the ground, he wiped grease off his hands with a rag and extended one to Callista. "Calder Sherborne. I was clearing a lot about 2 miles down the road and saw the tarp flapping. County records show this place has been empty since the late 70s. I thought it was abandoned." "It is mine," Callista said, crossing her arms to hide the shivering she could not control. Her voice came out harder than she intended, defensive and sharp, the voice of someone who had been given too many reasons not to trust strangers. Calder did not flinch. He did not mock her. Instead, he walked over to the fieldstone wall and ran a calloused thumb across the deteriorating mortar between the stones. His touch was careful, almost reverent, the way a doctor might examine a patient. "Beautiful structure," he said quietly. "Pre-Victorian. My family has worked masonry in this county for 3 generations. I have never seen pointing this old still, holding shape. He paused, pressing harder against a crumbling joint. But the mortar is failing. The foundation is settling badly on the eastern side. And that main chimney stack, he pointed to the massive stone column rising above the roofline. If you do not shore that up before the first heavy snowfall, the entire eastern wall is going to collapse inward. Callista's stomach dropped. I cannot afford a contractor. Calder studied her face, the soot smudged across her cheek, the blisters on her palms, the fierce wounded pride burning in her eyes. He was quiet for a long moment. I do not feel sorry for you, he said, and his voice carried no cruelty, only honesty. I feel sorry for the house. It is 150 years old and it deserves better than this. The words stung, but they were the first honest words anyone had spoken to Callista in weeks, and honesty, even when it hurts, is a kind of respect. Calder made a proposal. He needed to clear an acre of dense brush on a job site 2 miles down the road. Hard physical labor that required two people. If Callista helped him haul brush on her days off, he would help her rebuild the chimney and unblock the hearth so she would not freeze to death before Christmas. Callista hesitated. Then she extended her blistered hand. Fair trade. That evening, Calder drove his truck back to the small cabin where his grandfather lived, 3 miles deeper into the Bucks County woods. Callaway Sherborne was 72 years old, a master stonemason who had retired a decade ago, but never stopped working with his hands. When Calder arrived, Callaway was sitting at his oak workbench, sharpening a set of chisels with the slow, meditative precision of a man who had been doing the same thing for 50 years. Calder told him about Fenwick Cottage, about the girl living in it, about the fieldstone walls and the massive chimney and the mortar that was older than anyone alive. Callaway listened without interrupting. But when Calder said the girl's name, the old man's hands went still. Graves. Callaway set the chisel down on the bench. Did you say Graves? Her family kicked her out. She has got nothing. Sutton Torrance bankrupted 3 contractors in this county over the past 10 years. Callaway said, his voice low and hard. Anyone who gets tangled with that name gets ground to dust. She was thrown out by that family grandpa. She is not one of them. A shark's daughter is still a shark's daughter. Callaway picked up his chisel again and resumed sharpening. When trouble comes, and it will, you will get dragged to the bottom right alongside her. Stay away from that property, Calder. I mean it. Calder did not argue, but the next morning he drove his truck back to Fenwick Cottage. He chose the girl and the crumbling house over his grandfather's warning, and that choice would cost him something before it was over. Over the next week, they worked side by side. Calder taught Callista how to mix lime mortar, the traditional way, how to read the grain of fieldstone, how to tap a loose block back into place without disturbing the ones around it. He worked quietly, patiently, and without condescension, teaching the way someone teaches a person they believe is capable of learning. While repointing the chimney base, Calder noticed something that made him pause. He ran his fingers along the hearthstones inside the fireplace, frowning. This is strange, he said almost to himself. The hearthstones are granite. Nobody used granite for hearths in this region during this period. It was too expensive, too difficult to quarry locally. They would have used local slate or fieldstone. Granite means somebody went to significant trouble and cost to build this hearth floor. You only do that if you need the stone to bear serious weight, he shrugged, or if you are trying to make sure nobody can pry it up without the right tools. He moved on. He did not pursue the thought. It was a professional observation, nothing more filed away in the mental catalog of a man who had spent his life reading the stories that stones tell. But the detail lodged itself in Callista's mind like a splinter. The fragile piece Callista had built was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the yard washing soot off her hands in a bucket of freezing water when the crunch of expensive tires on the rutted driveway made her blood go cold. A sleek black Mercedes SUV navigated the muddy track with the careful arrogance of a vehicle that had never been designed for anything less than a paved boulevard. The driver's side door opened and Waverly Torrance stepped out. She was immaculate. Tailored wool coat, designer sunglasses, leather gloves. She looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the dying woods and the ruined cottage, like a magazine advertisement accidentally printed on the wrong page. From the passenger side emerged a man Callista had never seen before. He was approximately 40 years old, wearing an expensive charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had the polished, careful manner of someone whose entire career depended on making unpleasant things sound reasonable. My God, the smell! Waverly muttered, waving a gloved hand in front of her face. She stopped 10 feet from Callista, her eyes scanning the ruined cottage with undisguised revulsion. Look at you. You look like a feral animal. Your father would be mortified. My father does not know I exist unless you remind him, Callista shot back, wiping her hands on her jeans. You are trespassing Waverly. The man in the suit stepped forward with a practiced smile. Miss Graves, my name is Hewitt Rowland. I am the Director of Development for Pinnacle Holdings. We have recently acquired 300 acres of land surrounding this property for the construction of a luxury eco-resort. Your 1-acre parcel is positioned directly in the center of our planned access road. He opened his briefcase and produced a document. We are prepared to offer you $50,000 for the deed, cash, immediate transfer, today. $50,000. To a girl sleeping on a freezing floor, eating cold beans from a can, washing her clothes in creek water. It was a fortune. It was an apartment, a car, a semester of college tuition. It was warmth and safety and the end of suffering. But Roland was not finished. He stepped closer and his voice shifted into something softer, more intimate, more dangerous than Waverly's open contempt. Miss Graves, I understand your situation. I truly do. I have been in difficult circumstances myself. $50,000 can change your entire life. You do not have to live like this. He held out a business card. Even if you do not decide today, call me anytime. This offer does not expire. The sympathy in his voice was expertly crafted, warm enough to feel genuine, patient enough to seem kind. And that made it infinitely more dangerous than Waverly's sneering because it made Callista actually think. Waverly, unable to maintain the pretense of patience, cut in. Take the money, Callista. Buy a decent apartment. Stop embarrassing the family name. Callista looked from Roland to Waverly. She studied her stepmother's face and saw what Waverly was trying to hide: desperation. This was not a casual offer. Pinnacle Holdings had likely pressured Torrance Maritime. Or perhaps Waverly had promised the developers she could easily handle her discarded stepdaughter. Either way, Waverly needed Callista to say yes. Callista looked back at the ruined stone cottage. It was cold. It was broken. It was brutal. Every practical instinct in her body screamed at her to take the money and run. But underneath the practical screaming, something quieter spoke. Something that sounded like Verity's handwriting on a sealed envelope. Something that whispered, this house is more important than money. No, Callista said quietly. Waverly's smile vanished. The price is no, Callista said, her voice growing stronger, carrying across the clearing and echoing off the bare trees. Tell Pinnacle Holdings they can build their access road around my property. Now get off my land before I call the sheriff. Waverly stepped forward, her composure fracturing. Her voice dropped to a vicious hiss. You stupid, arrogant child. You have no money. You have no power. And you have no idea what you are dealing with. This house will fall on your head before Christmas, and they will take this land from your frozen corpse for pennies. We will ruin you. You already tried, Callista said evenly. Now leave. The Mercedes reversed down the driveway, spitting gravel. As it retreated, Callista saw Hewitt Rowland turn in the passenger seat and look back at her through the rear window. His expression was unreadable. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was too faint to hear over the wind, but if Callista could have listened, she would have heard him say, she refused. Proceed with Plan B, call the geophysical survey team. The connection between a polite business card and what would come next was already being drawn. The trap was already being set. Calder Sherborne walked around from the back of the house holding a heavy masonry chisel. He had heard every word. You just turned down $50,000 to live in a house with no roof, he said, raising one eyebrow. Callista stared down the empty driveway, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. I did not turn down money, she said. I bought my freedom. She turned and looked at the massive stone chimney rising above the roofline. The chimney with the granite hearth that made no sense, the chimney that her mother had paid to protect, and that a retired stonemason had once called abnormal. Now let us go tear apart that hearth. That night, the temperature plummeted with savage speed. The Weather Service issued an emergency alert for a massive nor'easter that was predicted to blanket Bucks County in 2 feet of snow within 48 hours. Wind chills would drop below zero. Power lines would fall. Roads would become impassable. Surviving the storm without a working fireplace was not difficult. It was impossible. The nor'easter arrived 2 hours ahead of schedule. By 6 in the evening, the wind was no longer gusting. It was sustained a constant howling pressure that bent the pine trees sideways and drove snow horizontally through every crack in the cottage walls. The temperature outside had already dropped below 20 degrees and was still falling. Inside Fenwick Cottage, Callista and Calder worked frantically by the glow of 3 kerosene lanterns, their breath rising in thick clouds racing against a storm that would not wait for them to be ready. The goal was simple and desperate: clear the collapsed debris inside the massive fieldstone chimney so the fireplace could function before the blizzard buried them. Without it, the kerosene heater alone would not sustain life through what the Weather Service was calling a once-in-a-decade event. Calder pulled his head out of the dark throat of the fireplace, his face coated in black soot from his forehead to his chin. "The blockage is severe," he said, spitting grit. "It is not just bird nests and leaves. The original clay liner collapsed decades ago. There are at least 500 pounds of solid brick and marite packed in there. We cannot pull it down from above. We have to open the base and drop the debris into the ash pit below." Before Callista could respond, the rumble of an engine cut through the storm noise. Headlights swept across the front windows. Callista grabbed the iron pry bar and moved toward the door, every muscle tensed. Nobody should have been driving in this weather. The door swung open before she reached it. Callaway Sherborne stepped inside, snow-caked on the shoulders of his heavy wool coat, carrying a leather tool case in one hand and a gallon of kerosene in the other. He kicked the door shut behind him and stood there, dripping meltwater onto the floorboards, his eyes adjusting to the lantern light. Calder froze. "Grandpa, you told me to stay away from this place." Callaway set the kerosene and the tool case down. He looked around the cottage, his gaze traveling across the walls, the sagging ceiling, the massive hearth. Then he looked at Callista. His expression was not warm. It was the expression of a man settling a debt. "I told you to stay away from the Torrance family," Callaway said. "This girl is not a Graves. She is Verity Winslow's daughter." The name landed in the room with weight. Callista stared at the old man. "You knew my mother." "I worked in this house in 1978, Callaway said, unbuttoning his coat. "Verity hired me to inspect the foundation. I spent 3 days examining every wall, every joint, every load-bearing structure. And when I got to this fireplace," he pointed one gnarled finger at the massive hearth, "I found something I had never seen in 40 years of masonry work." He walked to the hearth and knelt, pressing his palm flat against the rear hearthstone, the enormous rectangular slab of dark stone at the very back of the fireplace floor. "The ash pit beneath this hearth is deeper than it should be, significantly deeper. The dimensions do not match any design standard from the period. Whoever built this fireplace constructed a secondary chamber below the ash pit and sealed it with this slab." He rapped his knuckles against the granite. The sound was dense and solid, the sound of stone that had been placed with intention. "I told Verity what I found. She told me not to touch it and not to tell anyone. Ever." "And you did not," Callista said. "I did not." Callaway straightened up, his knees cracking. "I owed Verity a debt. She helped my wife when she was sick, drove her to treatments in Philadelphia when nobody else would. Verity asked me to keep my mouth shut about the hearth, and I kept it shut for nearly 50 years. But Verity is dead, and you are about to freeze to death in her house." He opened the leather tool case and pulled out a heavy masonry chisel and a 4-pound hammer. "So I am going to show your boy here the safest way to lift that slab. Then I am leaving, and what you find underneath is your business." Callaway worked with the practiced economy of a man who had been handling stone since before Calder was born. He showed Calder exactly where to position the pry bar at the rear seam, where the granite met the surrounding fieldstone, angled to exploit the natural fracture line in the mortar. He pointed to the stress points in the surrounding masonry that needed to be avoided. And then, without ceremony, he buttoned his coat, picked up his empty tool case, and walked to the door. "I paid what I owed Verity," he set, his hand on the latch. "From here on, this is yours." He looked at Calder. "Both of yours." Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. The headlights of his truck swept across the windows and disappeared into the white. Callista and Calder stood in the lantern light, looking at each other, looking at the hearthstone. "Ready?" Calder asked. Callista grabbed the iron pry bar. "Ready?" Calder positioned the wedge of the bar into the thick seam exactly where Calloway had indicated. Callista braced herself against the opposite side. Together they pushed. The ancient mortar, brittle and powdered with age, resisted for 3 agonizing seconds. Then it gave way with a crack sharp enough to make them both flinch. They levered the massive slab upward, muscles screaming, boots sliding on the dusty floor, until the stone reached its tipping point and fell forward onto the floorboards with a thunderous impact that shook the entire cottage. The lanterns swung on their hooks. Dust erupted from the cracks between the floor planks, and the sound seemed to keep traveling downward, as if the cottage itself had opened its mouth. Callista grabbed a lantern and knelt at the edge of the hole. She had expected a shallow pit filled with centuries of accumulated ash, dead rodents, and crumbled mortar. What she saw instead stopped her breathing. The space beneath the hearthstone was not an ash pit. It was a perfectly squared cavity, lined with carefully fitted masonry, completely devoid of ash or debris. The air that rose from the opening was shockingly cold and carried the heavy smell of oilcloth and old iron. The chamber was approximately 4 feet deep, and at the bottom, suspended on 2 iron brackets to keep it off the bare earth, sat a large and heavy strongbox, wrapped in layers of thick rubberized canvas that had begun to rot at the edges. The canvas was bound tightly with brass wire wound with the meticulous care of someone who had intended the contents to survive for a very long time. "Calder," Callista whispered. Her voice was tight, barely controlled. "Bring the light closer." Calder knelt beside her, his breath caught audibly in his throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lantern light played across the rubberized canvas, casting shadows across the stone walls of the hidden chamber. Outside, the storm raged against the cottage, as if trying to tear it apart. But inside, the air was perfectly still. "Help me lift it," Callista said. It took both of them straining their backs, one on each side, to haul the wrapped strongbox out of the crypt. It was shockingly heavy, well over 80 pounds, and they nearly dropped it twice before wrestling it onto the floorboards. Calder used wire cutters from his tool belt to snap the brass binding. Callista peeled back the stiff, rotting canvas with shaking hands. Beneath the canvas sat an iron lockbox adorned with intricate Victorian scrollwork. The heavy wrapping had preserved it with remarkable effectiveness. There was no rust, no corrosion. The lock was a massive brass padlock stamped with 2 initials in an ornate serif font, JG. Calder grabbed his 4-pound hammer and the hardened steel chisel his grandfather had left behind. He wedged the chisel into the shackle of the padlock and struck it with 3 massive blows that rang through the cottage like bells. The brass, made brittle by 130 years of cold storage, snapped on the 3rd strike. Callista reached out with trembling hands and pushed the heavy iron lid open. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound that had not been heard since the presidency of Benjamin Harrison. The interior of the box was lined with crushed red velvet that had faded over the decades to a dull rust color. The contents were impeccably organized, arranged with the precision of someone who understood that this might be the last time human hands would touch them. Sitting on top was a stack of leather-bound ledgers. Callista carefully lifted the first one and opened the cover. The pages were filled with columns of immaculate, sweeping handwriting. Names, dates, financial figures so large they seemed fictional. She read the first entry aloud, her voice barely audible over the storm. October 14th, 1891. Transfer of Erie Railroad capital to untraceable bearer reserves. Authorized by Jay Gould. Calder leaned in. His face had gone pale beneath the soot. "Jay Gould," he breathed. "The railroad tycoon, the robber baron." Beneath the ledgers lay several bundles wrapped in wax paper. Callista peeled back the first bundle and stared at what was inside her mind, struggling to process the information her eyes were delivering. They were banknotes, but unlike any currency she had ever seen. Slightly larger than modern bills, printed with a distinct golden-orange ink on the reverse side. The front bore the portrait of Alexander Hamilton, but the denomination printed in the corner defied comprehension. "Gold certificates," Calder said, his voice barely a whisper. "Series of 1882. There are dozens of bundles in here. These have never been circulated. They are pristine." But the money was not the most extraordinary thing in the box. Nestled in the far corner, cushioned by velvet, sat a heavy, tarnished silver humidor. Callista lifted the lid, and the lantern light, catching what lay inside, seemed to fracture into 1,000 green shards that danced across the cottage walls. It was a raw, uncut emerald, approximately the size of a man's fist, secured in a delicate lattice of pure gold wirework. The stone was unlike anything either of them had ever seen. It did not simply reflect light. It seemed to consume it and radiate it back transformed, as if the gem itself were a source of illumination. Tucked beneath the emerald was a folded piece of heavy vellum, sealed with dark red wax. Callista cracked the seal with her thumbnail and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was different from the ledger's, more personal, more urgent. She read it aloud. To whom it may concern, if you have found this cash, then my enemies have succeeded in destroying my public empire, and my trusted accountant Silas has perished guarding the secret. The United States government believes they have seized the entirety of my hidden railroad tariffs. They are fools. Let them have the pennies. The true wealth of the Erie Line and the Star of Bogota rests here. Guard it well, for the hounds of Wall Street will never stop hunting it. Jay Gould, 1892. The lantern flame guttered in a draft. Snow hissed against the windows. Callista sat back on her heels, the floorboards tilting beneath her, the room tilting with them. She had just unearthed the legendary lost reserves of one of the most ruthless financiers in American history, a treasure that historians had spent over a century dismissing as myth. They hid the artifacts beneath the floorboards of the bedroom, covered the opening with Callista's sleeping bag, and spent the rest of the night clearing the chimney debris through the now open ash pit. By dawn, for the first time since Callista had arrived at Fenwick Cottage, a fire burned in the massive fieldstone hearth. The warmth was almost unbearable after weeks of cold. Callista sat on the floor with her back against the warm stone, watching the flames, unable to sleep. Calder had passed out in the chair near the hearth, exhausted. The cottage creaked and groaned under the weight of accumulating snow. Callista pulled Hewitt Rowland's business card from her coat pocket. She had kept it. She did not know why. $50,000 had been the offer when this was just a worthless acre of woods. Now the contents of that iron box were worth a figure she could not bring herself to calculate. She picked up her phone. Rowland's number was right there on the card. If she called him, if she offered to negotiate directly, she could name a price that would end her suffering permanently. $1 million, $5 million, enough to never worry about anything ever again. Rowland was a businessman. He would understand value. She dialed the number. The phone rang once. And in that single ring, a thought cut through her like cold water. Rowland was not her ally. Rowland worked for Pinnacle Holdings, and Pinnacle Holdings had sent Waverly to this property. Any information she gave Rowland would reach Waverly within the hour. And Waverly would deploy Sutton's army of lawyers, claim the land, claim the treasure, claim everything, and Callista would be left standing in the snow with nothing but a garbage bag and a phone full of regret. She ended the call before the second ring. She tore the business card in half, then into quarters, and fed the pieces to the fire. She watched them curl and blacken and disappear. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out the sealed envelope that Tobin Caulfield had given her on the morning she bought the cottage. Verity's handwriting stared up at her from the front. The envelope was slightly bent from weeks of being pressed against her body, warm from her skin. Only open this when you truly need to remember why you are fighting. Callista slid her finger under the flap and tore it open. The letter inside was a single page written in Verity's careful hand. The ink was slightly faded, but every word was legible. Callista, my darling girl, if you are reading this letter, it means I was right about Sutton and that woman. I am sorry I could not be there to protect you myself. I am sorry I could not leave you money. Sutton took everything, but I left you the one thing he never knew about. That house is not just a roof over your head. I bought it because I knew it was hiding something. A stonemason I hired years ago told me the fireplace was built to conceal a chamber. I never found out exactly what was inside. I did not have the strength left in me to dig. But I knew it was there, and I knew that whatever it contained would be yours. Use it to build the life you deserve, and never let anyone tell you that your mother left you nothing. I love you more than you will ever know, Verity. Callista pressed the letter against her chest. She bent forward until her forehead touched her knees. And for the second time since she had been cast out of the Torrance estate, she wept. But these tears were nothing like the ones she had shed on the 19th night. Those had been tears of fury and helplessness. These were something else entirely. These were the tears of a daughter who had just learned that her mother, broke and dying, and outmaneuvered by a man with a $1 billion empire, had still found a way to fight for her child from beyond the grave. Verity had not known what was in the crypt. She had only known that something was there, and she had bet everything on the belief that it would be enough. Callista folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the first ledger beside the handwriting of Jay Gould, two letters from two different centuries locked together. When Calder woke, Callista told him about Dr. Harlan Braxton, the antiquities expert his grandfather had mentioned. Calder made the call from the porch, stamping snow off his boots. Braxton, retired and living in a brownstone in Philadelphia, was skeptical until Calder mentioned the year on the gold certificates. Then the old man's voice changed completely. He agreed to make the drive the next day, weather permitting. They waited. The storm buried the cottage under a white silence so total it felt like the world had stopped. Callista slept in front of the fire for the first time in warmth. She dreamed of her mother sitting in a diner booth, writing in a leather notebook, and when she looked up in the dream, Verity's face was Callista's own face, older and tired, but smiling. 2 days passed. The snow began to melt slightly under a pale winter sun. Callista was outside clearing the driveway with a shovel when she heard the crunch of tires on the snow-packed track. She looked up, expecting to see Braxton's car. What she saw instead sent adrenaline slamming through her veins. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled into the clearing, followed closely by Waverly's black Mercedes. And behind the Mercedes, idling at the edge of the property line with its diesel engine producing a low guttural rumble, sat a massive yellow Caterpillar bulldozer. Sheriff Mercer Moreland stepped out of his cruiser. He was a broad, thick-necked man in his 50s who looked like he had been forced to put on the uniform that morning at gunpoint. He carried a clipboard and would not meet Callista's eyes. Waverly exited the Mercedes with the precise theatrical timing of an actress making an entrance. Behind her came Hewitt Rollins, stepping out of a Pinnacle Holdings SUV that Callista had not noticed behind the bulldozer. His face was stripped of every trace of the warm sympathy he had worn during their first meeting. He looked at her the way a man looks at an obstacle on a blueprint. Callista Torrance, Sheriff Moreland, said, his voice carrying the exhausted resignation of a man doing something he knew was wrong. "I am sorry, miss, but I have been ordered to serve you with an emergency injunction." "An injunction for what?" Callista gripped the snow shovel with both hands. Waverly stepped forward, holding a sheet of official court letterhead between two gloved fingers. "Grand larceny, darling." Her smile was the smile of a predator that has cornered its prey and is savoring the moment before the kill. It turns out Pinnacle Holdings conducted a deep geophysical survey of this land before they made you that generous offer. Their instruments detected a massive metallic anomaly beneath the foundation of this shack. When you refused to sell, they reported their findings to your father's legal team. Roland spoke, and his voice was entirely different now. Cold, professional, without a trace of the man who had offered understanding and a business card. "Miss Graves, I tried to help you the easy way. You declined. That was your right. But now you are sitting on assets whose value is exponentially greater than what we offered. And a girl of 18 with no education, no counsel, and no resources cannot hold a position like that." He straightened his cuffs. "Courage is admirable, but courage does not survive a courtroom." Waverly continued, her eyes flashing. "Whatever you dug up under that hearth legally belongs to the estate of the previous landowner. And through a very convenient corporate acquisition completed at 9 o'clock this morning, that estate is now owned entirely by Torrance Maritime Corporation. So step aside, Callista. We are tearing this cottage down today." The words hit Callista with the force of a physical blow. She looked at the bulldozer. She looked at the sheriff. She looked at Waverly's triumphant face and Roland's calculating eyes. The combined weight of a corporation, a court order, a sheriff's badge, and a machine capable of reducing a century-old cottage to rubble in 10 minutes pressed down on her from every direction. "You have no jurisdiction here," Callista said. "This is private property." "Not anymore," Waverly said, holding the court order high. "The land belonged to a dormant holding company. Torrance Maritime absorbed it this morning. We have an emergency injunction from Judge Carmichael authorizing immediate demolition due to severe structural hazard. It is for your own safety, really." Sheriff Moreland cleared his throat. "Miss Graves, I have to enforce the order. If you do not step aside, I will be obligated to place you under arrest for trespassing on corporate property." The front door of this cottage banged open. Calder stepped off the porch, his 4-pound masonry hammer gripped loosely in his right hand. He planted himself beside Callista, his boots sinking into the snow, his jaw set. You fire up that bulldozer with us standing here, Sheriff, and you are looking at reckless endangerment and attempted vehicular manslaughter. Calder said, his voice steady and hard. I know the county district attorney personally. He will not provide cover for a corporate land grab. Waverly's lip curled. How touching. The feral girl found herself a stray dog. Sheriff arrests them both. Moreland reached for the handcuffs on his belt. Then the screech of tires ripped through the woods. A dust-covered Subaru Outback and a polished black town car came fishtailing up the snow-packed driveway, spraying white powder in twin arcs, forcing the bulldozer operator to slam his brakes. The vehicle slid to a halt at angles across the drive, blocking the path between the bulldozer and the cottage. Both doors of the Subaru flew open. Out stepped Tobin Caulfield, clutching a thick leather briefcase with both hands, his white hair wild from the drive, his wire-rimmed glasses fogged. He looked like a man who had driven 60 miles through a blizzard on 4 hours of sleep, which is exactly what he had done. From the town car emerged a second man. He was approximately 70, wearing a tweed overcoat with leather elbow patches and a pair of thick horn-rimmed glasses. He carried a smaller briefcase and moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had spent decades in rooms where other people were panicking. Dr. Harlan Braxton, the antiquities expert Calder had called. Sheriff Moreland, stop exactly where you are. Caulfield's voice boomed across the clearing, replacing his usual courtroom calm with the raw, savage authority of a man who had been practicing law since before the sheriff was born. He marched through the snow, pointing a bony finger directly at Waverly's face. If you execute that fraudulent injunction, I will personally see to it that you are stripped of your badge and sued into bankruptcy. Waverly sneered, Mr. Caulfield, you are an outdated relic chasing ambulances. My lawyers bypassed your ridiculous $1 contract hours ago. She never paid the estate, Caulfield countered, producing a laminated document from his briefcase and holding it up for the sheriff to see. She paid the consideration in cash directly to the executor of the trust, which is me. He tapped the notarized receipt time-stamped on the morning of Callista's 18th birthday. Under Pennsylvania property law, the moment that dollar touched my desk, the transfer of Fenwick Cottage and all subterranean mineral water and salvage rights became absolute and irrevocable. He turned to Sheriff Moreland and handed him a separate stack of papers. What Mrs. Graves neglected to tell Judge Carmichael is that Torrance Maritime purchased a defunct shell company that has not held the deed to this land in over 2 decades. Their injunction is based on a deliberate and criminal misrepresentation of ownership to a sitting judge. If you allow that machine to touch a single stone of my client's house, you will be charged as an accessory to corporate vandalism, destruction of private property, and contempt of a valid deed transfer. Moreland read the notarized receipt. He read the deed. He looked at Waverly, and for the first time, Callista saw something shift behind the sheriff's eyes. The reluctant obedience was replaced by something harder. Is this true? Moreland asked Waverly. Did you purchase a company that did not own the land? It is a legal gray area, Waverly shrieked, her composed veneer shattering completely. She is hiding stolen assets in that ruin. The developer's instruments confirmed a massive deposit of illegally held wealth beneath that hearth, and it belongs to her father. Dr. Braxton stepped forward, adjusting his glasses with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent his career in the company of objects far older and more valuable than anything in Waverly's jewelry box. Actually, madam, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of 50 years of scholarly expertise, whatever is beneath that hearth falls under established state precedent for abandoned antiquities found on privately held land. The only person with any legal claim to those artifacts is the rightful owner of the property on which they were discovered, which, according to the documents your own sheriff is currently holding, is this young woman. Sheriff Moreland handed the injunction back to Waverly. I am not touching this, Mrs. Graves. You misrepresented ownership to a judge to obtain an emergency court order. That is a felony in Pennsylvania. Get off this property before I cite you for filing a false report. Waverly's face contorted. This is not over, she screamed, her voice cracking, echoing through the bare trees. Sutton will bury you in litigation, Callista. We will tie this property up in appellate courts until you die of old age. You will never see a single dime of what is in there. Roland walked toward the SUV, but paused as he passed Callista. He leaned in close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You won this round. But Sutton Torrance has the resources to fight a war of attrition for 20 years. Are you certain you want to spend the next 2 decades of your life in courtrooms? There was something in his voice that was not entirely threatening, something that almost sounded like genuine concern, the last residue of the man who had offered her a business card and meant it. Then it was gone, and he walked away. Callista watched the convoy retreat down the driveway. The Mercedes, the SUV, the bulldozer reversing its massive treads with a grinding metallic scream. The sheriff's cruiser last of all pulling away slowly, as if Moreland wanted to put as much distance between himself and the Torrance family as physically possible. When the last engine faded into silence, Callista dropped the snow shovel. Her arms were shaking. Her legs were shaking. Everything was shaking. Calder placed a calloused hand on her shoulder. Steady, warm. Dr. Braxton looked at the crumbling stone cottage with an expression of intense academic curiosity. "Well, Miss Graves," he said, a slight smile forming beneath his horn-rimmed glasses. "Shall we go see what all the fuss is about?" Inside the cottage, Braxton spent nearly 2 hours examining the contents of the iron lockbox. He worked with white cotton gloves and a jeweler's loupe, handling each artifact with the reverence of a priest handling communion silver. He examined the gold certificates one at a time, holding each to the lantern light and studying the engraving. He read every page of every ledger, turning the yellowed leaves with a care that bordered on devotion. And he spent a long, silent time with the emerald, rotating it slowly in the light, watching the green fire shift and refract inside the stone. When he was finished, he sat back. He removed his glasses and cleaned them on his tweed coat. And he looked at Callista with an expression she had never seen on another human being's face. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of history. Jay Gould was arguably the most ruthless financial operator of the Gilded Age, Braxton said, his voice hushed. When the federal government moved to dismantle his monopolies in the early 1890s, rumors circulated for years that he had liquidated a massive portion of the Erie Railroad's hidden assets into untraceable bearer instruments, gold reserves, and rare gemstones. The goal was to keep the wealth beyond the reach of federal seizure. Every serious historian in the field has spent the past century searching for evidence of this cache. Most concluded it was a myth. He looked at the emerald sitting on its velvet bed, pulsing with green light. "It is not a myth." "How much?" Calder asked. Braxton sighed and tapped his chin. "The Star of Bogota alone is a world-class gemological artifact. Uncut emeralds of this size and clarity surface on the international market perhaps once every 50 years. The uncirculated gold certificates are numismatic holy grails. If you attempted to sell this collection on the open market, it would trigger a global frenzy." He paused. "Conservatively, you are looking at a combined value of $85 to $90 million. Callista's knees buckled. Calder caught her elbow and held her upright. But Caulfield, standing by the window with his arms folded, brought them all back to earth. "Waverly was right about one thing," he said gently. "Sutton Torrance has billions at his disposal. He will file injunction after injunction. He will claim the treasure is stolen property, that the land transfer was fraudulent, that the trust was improperly executed. He will freeze your assets in litigation for 20 years, bleeding you dry, with legal fees, hoping you exhaust your resources and surrender." The room fell silent. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the cottage walls. Callista looked at the glowing ink on the centuries-old currency. She thought about the garbage bag on the gravel driveway. She thought about the freezing creek where she had hauled water. She thought about the marble step where Waverly had placed a dollar bill for her to pick up like a dog retrieving a bone. She thought about Rowland's voice in the snow, quiet and almost kind, telling her that courage does not survive a courtroom. "No," Callista said. Her voice had changed. Something had shifted behind it, some final mechanism clicking into place, transforming raw defiance into something colder and more precise. "He will not freeze anything." She looked at Braxton. "Dr. Braxton, do you have contacts at the federal level?" "The Smithsonian, the Department of the Treasury. I have the personal cell phone number of the director of the National Archives." Braxton replied, raising an eyebrow. "Why, because Jay Gould stole this wealth from the American public," Callista said. "He evaded federal taxes and tariffs on a scale that makes modern white-collar crime look like shoplifting. If I try to keep everything, I fight my father alone, his lawyers against mine, His billions against my nothing. I will lose. Not because I am wrong, but because he can afford to wait longer than I can. She paused. The firelight played across her face, casting half of it in shadow. But if I offer to repatriate the gold certificates and the ledgers to the United States government under the National Antiquities Act, then the federal government becomes my partner. They will step in with the full weight of the Department of Justice to protect their new asset from any private claim. Sutton's lawyers would not be fighting a girl with $1 and a garbage bag. They would be fighting the United States of America. Caulfield stared at her. Then he let out a sound that was half laugh and half bark of pure stunned admiration. And in exchange, I donate the historical documents and the certificates. In return, I negotiate a guaranteed tax-free finder's fee, absolute immunity from private litigation related to the discovery, and I retain full undisputed ownership of the emerald to auction at my discretion. The room was silent for 10 full seconds. That, Braxton said softly, is the most strategically brilliant thing I have heard in 40 years of dealing with antiquities. Callista did not smile. There was nothing to smile about yet. This was not victory. This was the opening move in a chess game against an opponent with infinite resources, and she had just figured out how to put the king of the board on her side. That evening, after Caulfield and Braxton had left to begin making calls, Callista drove Calder's truck into town. She walked into Lark Felding's diner and sat at the counter. It was nearly midnight. The diner was empty except for a long-haul trucker nursing coffee in the far booth. Lark emerged from the kitchen, took one look at Callista's face, and pulled her into the back. "Your mother told me something," Lark said, her voice low and direct. "The last summer before she died. She sat right here at this counter and said, 'Lark, I found something in the county records. That property is connected to old money, the kind that disappears on purpose. I bought that house for Callista. Whatever is buried there, it belongs to her, not Sutton.'" Lark took Callista's hands in both of hers. Her grip was strong, weathered, certain. "Your mother did not leave you a broken-down house child. She left you a weapon." Callista drove back to Fenwick Cottage through empty country roads glazed with ice. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating bare trees and stone walls, and mile after mile of silence. She knew exactly what she had to do. She knew the risks. She knew the timeline. Caulfield had received word that afternoon Sutton Torrance had already retained the largest litigation firm in Philadelphia to file a new civil action. Not another injunction, a federal civil suit requesting that the court freeze all assets on the Fenwick property pending a determination of ownership rights. If that motion was granted before the federal repatriation deal was finalized, everything would be locked in legal ice for years. They had 5 days, maybe less. The first call to Washington was made at 7:15 in the morning and from the kitchen table of Fenwick Cottage, which was not really a kitchen table at all, but a plank of salvaged oak balanced across 2 sawhorses. Callista sat on one side with a mug of black coffee, her hair still damp from melting snow. Tobin Caulfield sat on the other with a legal pad covered in notes so dense they looked like hieroglyphics. Between them, propped on its side, was Calder's phone on speaker. Dr. Harlan Braxton was already in Philadelphia, seated in his brownstone study, speaking with a measured urgency that Callista had not heard from him before. On the other end of his call, connected through a secure government line, was the deputy director of the National Archives, a woman named Catherine Spears, who had spent 30 years managing the acquisition of historically significant artifacts for the federal government. Braxton had sent her photographs of the gold certificates and the first 3 pages of the Gould ledgers at 4 in the morning. By 6, Spears had assembled a preliminary authentication team. By 7, she was asking how quickly she could get her people to Bucks County. "We can have a team on site within 48 hours, Spears said through the phone speaker, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "If the certificates are authentic, this is the most significant discovery of hidden Gilded Age financial instruments in American history." Caulfield leaned toward the phone. "Dr. Spears, we have a timing problem." He explained the situation in crisp, unadorned language. Sutton Torrance had retained Morrison and Kettridge, the largest litigation firm in Philadelphia, to file a federal civil action seeking to freeze all assets on the Fenwick property. The motion would be before a judge within 5 days. If it was granted before the repatriation agreement was signed, the artifacts would be locked in legal ice indefinitely and Sutton would have exactly what he wanted: time. Enough time to bleed Callista dry. Enough time to wear down her resolve. Enough time to make her disappear. Then we move faster than 5 days, Spears said. The authentication team arrived 36 hours later in a white unmarked van with federal plates. 3 specialists in period currency, 2 archivists trained in 19th century documentation, and an armed escort that stayed in the van and said nothing to anyone. They spent 14 hours inside Fenwick Cottage, working under portable examination lights that they powered with a generator they brought with them. Braxton supervised every step, his horn-rimmed glasses reflecting the bright halogen as he cross-referenced serial numbers against Federal Treasury records that had been sealed for over a century. At 11 o'clock that night, the lead authenticator, a thin woman with silver hair and steady hands, looked up from her examination table and said 3 words to Spears over the phone. They are genuine. The negotiation began the following morning. 2 representatives from the federal government drove out to Fenwick Cottage. One was from the Department of the Treasury. The other represented the Smithsonian Institution's American History Division. They were both men in their 50s, wearing dark suits that looked profoundly out of place in a room with exposed stone walls and a fire crackling in a hearth that had hidden $90 million for 130 years. Calder had built 2 extra chairs from scrap lumber the night before so they would have somewhere to sit. The Treasury representative opened with his offer, a finder's fee of $15 million, full repatriation of all artifacts including the emerald. Standard federal acquisition terms. Callista listened without expression. She was seated on the hearthstone, the same slab of granite that had concealed Jay Gould's crypt for over a century, now serving as her chair. She held her coffee mug in both hands and did not speak for a long time after the offer was presented. $15 million, she finally said, and you want the emerald. The Star of Bogota is of immense historical significance, the Smithsonian representative said carefully. We believe it belongs in a national collection where the public can appreciate it. I appreciate it fine right here, Callista said, and I am the public. Caulfield, seated beside her, kept his face neutral, but his pen had stopped moving on his legal pad, which meant he was paying very close attention. The Treasury representative shifted in his scrap lumber chair. Miss Graves, you should understand that the federal government is offering you a significant sum in exchange for artifacts that could arguably be classified as stolen federal property. Jay Gould evaded taxes and tariffs that were owed to the United States. A case could be made that these items belong to the government by right without any finder's fee at all. Callista set her mug down on the hearthstone. She stood up. She walked to the fireplace and picked up a piece of split oak from the woodpile. She placed it carefully on the fire, adjusting its position with the iron poker until the flames caught. She took her time. She was in no hurry. The room waited. You could make that case, Callista said, still facing the fire, and you might even win it in about 8 to 12 years after it works its way through the federal court system, during which time Sutton Torrance will be filing his own claims and the artifacts will be sitting in a government warehouse accruing legal fees instead of sitting in the Smithsonian accruing public interest. Your director will spend a decade explaining to Congress why the most important Gilded Age discovery in American history is locked in a storage facility because the Treasury Department tried to shortchange an 18-year-old girl. She turned around. The firelight was behind her, casting her face in warm shadow. Or you can close this deal today. $45 million. Tax-free, classified as a federal preservation grant. Full immunity from any private litigation related to the discovery. And I keep ownership of the emerald with a 6-month loan to the Smithsonian for public exhibition before I auction it privately. $30 million, the Treasury representative countered, and the emerald. Callista did not respond. She sat back down on the hearthstone, picked up her coffee, and drank. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The fire popped and hissed. The wind pressed against the new window glass. Caulfield recognized what she was doing. He had seen it deployed by negotiators 3 times her age with 50 times her experience. The principle was ancient and devastating in its simplicity. The first person to speak after a counteroffer has been made is the person who loses. Callista Torrance was 18 years old. She had been homeless for less than 3 months. She was wearing a flannel shirt with soot stains on the cuffs and boots that were held together with duct tape. And she was playing the 2 federal representatives with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. $45 million, Callista said without looking up from her coffee. I do not negotiate against myself. The Treasury representative looked at the Smithsonian representative. The Smithsonian representative looked at the fire. Braxton, standing by the window with his arms folded, allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "We accept," the Treasury representative said. The documents were drafted by Caulfield over the next 72 hours, reviewed by federal counsel, and signed on a Tuesday morning in the living room of Fenwick Cottage. Callista signed her name beside the signatures of two deputy directors and a representative of the Attorney General's office. The ink on the page was the same dark blue that Verity had used to write her daughter's name on a sealed envelope months ago. The federal government was now Callista's co-claimant. Any attempt by Sutton Torrance to challenge the discovery contest, the property transfer, or seize the artifacts would require his lawyers to file suit not against a teenager with a garbage bag, but against the Department of Justice of the United States. Morrison and Kettridge, for all their billable hours in mahogany conference rooms, would not touch that case with a 10-foot pole. Sutton's civil motion was denied by the federal judge 3 days later. The judge cited the government's CHIO claimant status and the completed repatriation agreement. In a footnote that would later be quoted in 3 separate legal journals, the judge wrote that the petitioner's attempt to assert ownership over federally designated antiquities through a hastily acquired shell company represented a troubling pattern of corporate overreach. Caulfield read the ruling aloud to Callista over the phone. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Caulfield said very quietly, "Your mother would have loved this." The restoration of Fenwick Cottage began 3 days after the federal agreement was signed, paid for with an advance from the finder's fee that Caulfield negotiated from the Treasury Department's Expedited Disbursement Fund. Callista did not hire a general contractor. She did not bring in a crew from the city. She called 2 people. Calder arrived at dawn with a truckload of dark slate roofing tiles and 12 bags of hydraulic lime. Callaway Sherborne arrived an hour later in his old pickup, carrying the same leather tool case he had brought the night of the storm. He stepped out of the truck, looked at the cottage in the pale morning light, and stood very still for a long time. "Last time I was here in daylight was 1978, Callaway said. He walked to the eastern wall and pressed his palm flat against the field stone, the same gesture his grandson had made weeks earlier. "Verity asked me to check the foundation. I told her the house was solid, but the mortar needed repointing. She said she would get to it eventually." He took his hand away and looked at the wall with the practiced eye of a man who could read a building's history in its joints. 48 years later, here I am, repointing it. Callaway had refused to help when Calder first told him about Callista. He had warned his grandson to stay away. He had called her a shark's daughter. But something had changed in the old man since the night of the storm, since he had walked into the cottage and seen Verity Winslow's daughter kneeling beside a fireplace that held a secret Verity had guarded for decades. He never said what changed. He simply showed up with his tools and went to work. The 3 of them spent 2 weeks rebuilding Fenwick Cottage. Callaway oversaw the masonry, teaching Calder and Callista the old method's hydraulic lime mortar. Instead of Portland cement, mixed by hand in wooden troughs, applied with flat trowels, and shaped with the edge of a thumb. He showed them how to read the existing stonework and match the new pointing to the original patterns, preserving the visual rhythm of the wall rather than imposing a modern uniformity. He explained that a properly pointed stone wall breathes in, allowing moisture to pass through the lime mortar rather than trapping it behind cement, which was why the cottage had survived 150 years while buildings half its age were already crumbling. The sagging roof was stripped and replaced with split dark slate, each tile hung by hand on copper nails. The shattered windows were removed and replaced with custom leaded glass fabricated by a glazier in Doylestown who had learned the craft from his father. The ivy was cut back from the eastern wall, revealing stonework that had not seen sunlight in decades. And the chimney, the massive fieldstone column that had guarded Jay Gould's secret for over a century, was repointed from base to cap, every joint cleaned out and filled with fresh lime, every loose stone reset and secured. On the last day of the restoration, Callaway stood in the yard looking at the finished cottage. Smoke curled from the chimney against the sky that was beginning to soften with the first warmth of early spring. The old man's eyes were wet, though he would have denied it. "My grandfather taught me that stone tells stories," Callaway said to Calder, who was standing beside him with mortar dust in his hair. "This house told its story. Now it gets to start a new one." It was the first time in Calder's life that his grandfather had spoken to him without a trace of caution or warning in his voice. Something between them had mended during the work, not through conversation, but through the shared labor of rebuilding something that mattered. 5 days before Sutton Torrance arrived at Fenwick Cottage, a convoy of 3 armored federal transport vehicles pulled into the newly paved driveway. The vehicles were olive drab, unmarked, except for small Department of the Treasury seals on the rear doors. A team of 6 specialists in white gloves and dark suits entered the cottage, carrying reinforced archival cases lined with acid-free foam. Callista stood on the porch and watched them work. They handled the gold certificates with extraordinary care, placing each bundle into a sealed, humidity-controlled container. The ledgers were photographed page by page before being secured in separate cases. The silver humidor was wrapped in conservation-grade tissue and placed in a foam-lined crate. The emerald was the last item to leave. A Smithsonian curator examined it one final time with a jeweler's loupe, then placed it in a custom-fitted case with a biometric lock. Callista signed a 6-month loan agreement granting the Smithsonian exhibition rights. When the case closed around the greenstone, she felt something release in her chest, not loss, but the unburdening of a weight she had not fully realized she was carrying. The $45 million cleared her private accounts the following morning. Caulfield called to confirm. His voice cracked slightly on the phone just once before he steadied himself. "It is done, Callista. Every penny tax-free. The immunity clause is ironclad. No private entity can challenge the discovery or the property transfer. You are free." Callista thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table, which was now an actual kitchen table oak hand, built by Calder, set in a newly installed kitchen, that blended modern function with the cottage's original timber framing. She stared at the number on her banking app for a long time. Then she closed the app and put the phone in her pocket. The money did not feel like she thought it would. It did not feel like victory or vindication or triumph. It felt like a door closing, the right door, but a door nonetheless. That afternoon, Callista drove Calder's truck into Doylestown one last time. She parked outside Lark Felding's diner and walked through the front door. The bell above the glass chimed the same bell that had chimed on the morning Callista had stumbled in with a garbage bag and 9% batteries, starving and freezing and owning nothing in the world except a crumpled dollar bill. Lark was behind the counter, wiping it with the same rag she always used, wearing the same grease-stained apron with her name embroidered on the chest. She looked up and saw Callista, and something in her weathered face softened in a way that Callista had only seen once before on the morning Verity's daughter had first walked through that door. Callista sat at the counter. She placed a check on the surface between them and slid it across. "For the coffee and the toast," she said, "from my first morning." Lark picked up the check. She looked at the amount. She looked at Callista. Then she tore it cleanly in half, placed the 2 pieces on the counter, and said, "I do not charge family." Lark came around the counter, something she rarely did during business hours, and pulled Callista into an embrace. It was not gentle. It was firm and strong and unapologetic, the embrace of a woman who had spent her whole life on her feet and had arms that proved it. Callista buried her face in Lark's shoulder and breathed in the smell of coffee and bacon grease and something floral underneath that might have been soap or might have been memory. It was the first time since Verity's death that another woman had held her. When they separated, Lark held Callista at arm's length and studied her face. "There is one more thing your mother would want you to know," Lark said. "Verity did not buy that property by accident. She spent 2 years researching its history before she made the purchase. She found records in the county library, old land surveys, and tax documents that connected the property to a wealthy family from the 1890s. She never found definitive proof of what was hidden there, but she found enough to believe that the house was worth more than anyone knew." Lark released Callista's shoulders. "Your mother was not lucky, child. She was patient, and she was willing to bet everything on her daughter." Callista drove back to Fenwick Cottage as the sun dropped toward the tree line, painting the bare oaks in shades of amber and copper. The road was clear of snow for the first time in months. Green was beginning to appear at the edges of things, in the ditches along the fence lines and the tight buds forming on the branches overhead. The world was preparing to come back to life. The next morning, the sound of an engine broke the early quiet. Callista was sitting on the edge of the hearth, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching flames move across the logs. Calder was in the kitchen cooking eggs on the new stove, the smell of butter and toast filling the cottage, with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Through the window, she saw a silver Bentley pull up the driveway and park beside Calder's truck. Sutton Torrance stepped out. He had aged visibly in the months since Callista had last seen him. His hair, which had always been meticulously groomed, was uncombed. His suit, which had always been impeccable, was wrinkled at the collar and cuffs. He walked toward the front door with the uncertain gait of a man approaching a building he was no longer sure he had the right to enter. Callista opened the heavy oak door before he could knock. "Callista," Sutton said. He attempted a smile. It was the kind of smile that a man assembles from memory when he has forgotten what genuine warmth feels like. The right muscles moving in the right directions, producing nothing. His eyes moved past her, scanning the interior of the cottage, cataloging the renovations. The new kitchen, the restored hearth, the leaded glass windows, performing the rapid mental arithmetic of a man who has spent his entire career calculating the value of things. "Sweetheart, you have done wonders with the place," he said. "I came to apologize." Waverly acted completely out of line. "I have filed for divorce. I should have done it years ago. I see that now." Callista leaned against the door frame and sipped her coffee. She did not invite him in. "You are a little late to play the loving father Sutton." The name, not dad, not father, but Sutton, landed between them with precision. She watched him absorb it. She watched the flinch he tried to hide. "I know I made mistakes." Sutton pressed, stepping closer. His voice shifted into the register he used in boardrooms, the tone of manufactured sincerity that had closed 1,000 deals. "But we are family. I can help you manage what you found. The corporate tax implications of antiquities are brutal. If you fold the assets into Torrance Maritime, I can shelter them for you. We can structure it as a family trust. A split. Even a 10% management fee for me would leave you incredibly wealthy." Callista watched him speak. She watched his hands, the way they moved in practiced gestures, palms open, fingers spread, the body language of a man selling something. She watched his eyes and saw the desperation behind the performance, the raw, scrambling need of a man who could feel his empire cracking beneath his feet and was looking for any handhold to stop the fall. "You really do not read the news, do you?" Callista asked softly. Sutton's rehearsed expression faltered. "I do not have the treasure, Sutton. The federal armored transports came and took the certificates and the ledgers to Washington 5 days ago. The Smithsonian received the emerald on loan the day before yesterday. It is currently sitting in a climate-controlled display case in the National Museum of American History, and approximately 4,000 people have already stood in line to see it." The color drained from Sutton's face in stages, starting at his forehead and moving downward as if his blood were retreating from the surface of his skin. "You gave away $90 million. "I did not give it away," Callista said. "I negotiated a $45 million finder's fee classified as a federal preservation grant, completely tax-exempt. The full amount cleared my private accounts yesterday morning. It is held in institutions that you cannot reach under legal protections that your lawyers cannot circumvent, in a structure that Tobin Caulfield spent 3 weeks building specifically to be Sutton Torrance proof." She let that settle. She watched him do the math. She watched him understand that the money was real, that it was beyond his reach, and that every door he might have used to access it had already been welded shut. "And there is one more thing," Callista said. Sutton took a step backward. It was involuntary, the instinctive retreat of a man who has just heard the click of a mechanism he cannot see. "In the ledgers," Callista continued, and her voice was steady and precise, carrying no anger, no triumph, only the cold clarity of someone delivering facts. "Jay Gould documented in meticulous detail how he used shell companies to illegally seize land and assets from private citizens. The methods were remarkably sophisticated for the 1890s. Dummy corporations, fraudulent deeds of transfer, emergency court orders obtained through misrepresentation." She paused. The fire crackled behind her. Attorney Caulfield noticed that the methods Gould described bore a striking resemblance to the methods that Torrance Maritime Corporation employed when it purchased a defunct shell company and used it to obtain a fraudulent emergency injunction to demolish my house. The parallels were extensive enough that Caulfield compiled a detailed analysis and submitted it to the Securities and Exchange Commission 4 days ago. Sutton's phone began to vibrate in his jacket pocket. He did not reach for it. He stared at his daughter with the expression of a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. I believe, Callista said quietly, that the federal auditors are conducting a surprise inspection of your downtown offices right about now. Sutton pulled the phone from his pocket. He looked at the screen. Callista could not see what was on it, but she could see his hands. They were trembling so violently that he nearly dropped the device. The phone kept vibrating. Call after call after call, stacking up on the screen, each one a nail in a coffin that Sutton had built for himself. He lowered the phone. For a long moment, he stood on the porch of Fenwick Cottage, looking at his daughter, and Callista saw something she had never expected to see on her father's face. Not rage, not calculation. Something worse. Recognition. The terrible, belated recognition of a man who has just realized that the person standing in front of him is the consequence of every cowardly choice he ever made. He did not apologize. He did not beg. He did not threaten. Instead, he said something that Callista would remember for the rest of her life. "Your mother," Sutton said, and his voice cracked, splintering along a fault line that had been forming for decades. "Always told me you would be stronger than I was. I hated her for it." He did not say he was sorry for hating Verity. He did not say he was wrong. He simply stated it the way a man states a diagnosis he has been avoiding for years, with the exhausted surrender of someone who no longer has the energy to pretend. Sutton Torrance turned away from his daughter's door. He walked to the silver Bentley with the stiff, careful steps of a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. He opened the door. He sat behind the wheel. And he drove down the newly paved driveway past the mailbox, past the stone wall at the property line, past the ancient oaks that Verity had walked beneath when she first found this place, and he disappeared around the bend in the road and out of Callista Torrance's life forever. Callista stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded completely. The silence that replaced it was enormous, filling the clearing, filling the woods, filling the space inside her chest, where the anger had lived for so long that she had forgotten what the space felt like without it. She closed the heavy oak door. The cottage was warm. The fire was burning steadily in the hearth that had survived 150 years, that had sheltered Jay Gould's secret, that Verity Winslow had purchased to protect, that Callaway Sherborne had recognized as extraordinary, that Calder Sherborne had helped open, and that Callista had transformed from a hiding place into a foundation. Calder was standing by the hearth with 2 plates of eggs and toast, one in each hand. His boots were dusted with mortar from the previous day's work on the garden wall. His dark hair was uncombed. His expression was calm, patient, certain the expression of a man who had chosen to be here and who was not leaving. "Everything handled?" he asked. Callista did not answer immediately. She walked to the fireplace and reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt. She pulled out a photograph, small and faded its edges, soft from months of being carried against her body. Verity Winslow Torrance, age 32, smiling at the camera with dark eyes that Lark Felding had recognized instantly across a diner counter in the early morning light. Callista set the photograph on the hearthstone, leaning it against the warm fieldstone wall. Verity looked out from the picture at the room she had never seen restored, at the fire she had never felt, at the daughter she had fought for, with nothing but patience and faith, and a secret she had carried to her grave. "Everything," Callista said. She took Calder's hand. His palm was rough and warm and steady. "We are finally home." The fire burned in the hearth of Fenwick Cottage as the last of the winter coal retreated from Bucks County. Outside the leaded glass windows, the first green shoots of early spring pushed through the dark Pennsylvania soil. A cardinal landed on the newly repaired windowsill, cocked its red head at the glass, and flew off into the brightening morning. Inside, Callista Torrance sat in a house that had cost $1. A house that a dying mother had bought with the last of her hope. A house that a frightened girl had refused to sell for $50,000, then refused to surrender to a bulldozer, then refused to lose to a billion-dollar corporation. A house that had hidden a treasure for over a century and had given it up only when the right person was ready to find it. The photograph of Verity Winslow stood on the hearthstone lit by firelight. In the kitchen, Calder Sherborne was washing dishes and humming something tuneless and content. Somewhere in Doylestown, Lark Felding was pouring coffee for the morning regulars and not telling anyone what she knew. In Philadelphia, Tobin Caulfield was filing the last of the federal paperwork in a manila folder that he would keep in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. In a cabin 3 miles into the woods, Callaway Sherborne was sharpening his chisels at his oak workbench the way he did every morning, the way his father had taught him, the way his grandson would teach his own children someday. And in Washington, D.C., behind a panel of museum-grade glass and a climate-controlled gallery, on the second floor of the National Museum of American History, a raw, uncut emerald, the size of a man's fist, sat in its lattice of gold wire, catching the overhead lights and scattering them into green fire across the faces of the visitors who lined up day after day to see it. The placard beside the display read, "The Star of Bogota, discovered at Fenwick Cottage, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, by Callista Torrance, on loan from a private collection." Beneath that, in smaller text, this artifact was hidden beneath the hearthstone of a cottage purchased for $1. It was found by a young woman who had nothing except the courage to refuse to give up, and a mother who loved her enough to plan for a future she would never see. Every word of it was true. If Callista's incredible journey from a discarded daughter to a woman who outmaneuvered a billion-dollar corporation, negotiated with the federal government, and turned a crumbling cottage into a home inspired, you take a moment to share this story. Real treasures, the kind worth finding, are not always buried under hearthstones. Sometimes they are the people who refuse to break, the mothers who plan in secret, the strangers who offer coffee without being asked, and the old stonemasons who show up in a snowstorm to pay a debt to a woman who has been gone for years. The real fortune is never the money. It is knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone take that from you. What would you do if you found a secret chamber beneath your floor? And more importantly, what would your mother have done to make sure you were the one who found it?